This week, we are going to talk about the triumph of the right. So we'll look specifically at the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George Bush. So leading up to the 1980s, we see that America during the 1960s and 1970s is kind of going through a tumultuous period, and they're kind of looking for a way to go back to simpler times. So we have the conservative ascendance. So more libertarian in its economics and more politically forceful in its conservative religious principles than moderate brands of conservatism, which were popular after World War II. This new sect of the Republican Party called the New Right had by the 1980s evolved into the most influential wing of the Republican Party. So building on the gradual unraveling of New Deal political orders in the 1960s and 1970s, the conservative movement not only enjoyed the guidance of politicians like Reagan, but they also drew energy from a broad range of grassroots activists. So grassroots activists are people who they try to change what's going on nationally by first looking at and trying to change what's going on in their individual cities or their individual towns. So enduring conflicts over race, economic policy, sexual politics, and foreign affairs fractured the liberal consensus that had dominated American politics since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, and the New Right attracted support from what were known as Reagan Democrats, who were blue-collar voters who had lost faith in the old liberal creed. So liberalism no longer seemed to offer the great mass of white Americans a roadmap to prosperity, so they searched for new political solutions. So liberalism is a political philosophy which is both political and economic, and it emphasizes individual autonomy, equality of opportunity, and the protection of individual rights. So the right to life, liberty, and property. Christian conservatives also felt themselves under siege from liberalism. So each wing of this new right movement, so the disaffected northern blue-collar workers, white Southerners, evangelicals, this whole group, they turned to the Republican Party as the most effective vehicle for their political counterassault on liberalism and the New Deal political order. So once again, as we are heading into the 1980s, we see that Americans, their mindset, their ideologies, they're starting to shift. And so they are looking for a change when they get to the 1980 election.
The League of Women Voters is proud to present this presidential debate.
After weeks of long-distance sparring in the media, President Carter and Ronald Reagan are face-to-face for the first and what will be the only time in the campaign.
The ground rules for this, as agreed by you gentlemen, are these.
With an estimated 80 million Americans watching at home, for both candidates, this is the moment of truth.
The Reagan people were a little worried about how Reagan might do because he was never one for having a lot of hard facts at his fingertips. He spoke in themes. And I think the Carter people were also worried that Reagan might show them up.
When Mr. Carter became president, inflation was 4.8%. It is now running at 12.7%. He has blamed the people of living too well. We don't have inflation because the people are living too well. We have inflation because the government is living too well.
I'm surprised Governor Reagan brought this up.
Carter cited chapter and verse in Reagan's record that wasn't good.
In California, he had the three largest tax increases in the history of that state under his administration. He also advocates nuclear superiority with the Soviet Union. This attitude is extremely dangerous and belligerent in its tone.
It is just not true. My point I have made already calls for a mutual reduction of these weapons, as I say, to the point that neither of us can represent a threat.
By the 80th minute of the debate, Reagan and Carter had each landed some jabs. But there's still no decisive winner. With only 5 minutes to go, the time to land the knockout punch is running out.
I was drafted to write a final statement, which are very important in these debates. We came up with a series of rhetorical questions for him, and one of them was, just ask yourself,
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
and 70-80% of Americans sitting in their living room said, you know what? I'm not better off. I'm worse off than I was when Jimmy Carter became president.
If you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
Not quite 1/5 of the nation's vote has been counted on this election day, but Ronald Reagan has jumped into a very early and a sweeping lead.
As the returns start rolling in on election night, the Reagans are at home in Los Angeles.
He's in the shower, she's in the bathtub, and the phone rings, and she answers it, and they say it's Jimmy Carter calling to concede, and she's banging on the shower door saying, Ronnie, you've won. And he comes out of the shower and dripping wet with the towel around him, hears Jimmy Carter concede the election to him.
So here are the results from the 1980 election. So we can really see, based off of the overall vote, which was 489 for Reagan and only 49 for Carter, that Americans were really looking for a change in what was going on in America. So the issues of the day for the 1980 election were the Iran hostage crisis, which we recently talked about, the USSR invasion of Afghanistan, and inflation. Okay, so with the election of Ronald Reagan, we have First Lady Nancy Reagan. So Nancy Reagan was the second wife of Reagan. She was originally a Broadway actress, and she served as First Lady from 1981 to 1989. She was known for her passionate advocacy for decreasing drug and alcohol abuse, and one of the main things that she focused on, which she was often criticized for, was White House upkeep. Because when she got into the White House, she noticed that a lot of the White House had been neglected, and so she focused a lot of her time and energy on kind of restoring it to its former glory. So these are some, I'll show you 2 anti-drug ads from the 1980s.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? It's yours?
No,
Mother said she found it in your closet.
I don't know. One of the guys must
Must have what?
Look, Dad, it's
Where
not.
did you get it?
Dad,
Answer me. Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
Parents who use drugs have children who use drugs.
This.
I get angry just thinking about it makes me mad. Little kids doing drugs, it turns my stomach. That stuff hurts. It stops you from living up to your potential. It holds you back. It hurts the user. It hurts his family. And it hurts his friends. I just want to shake some sense into you kids that are using drugs and think about using it. So remember, don't, or else. Okay? I get angry.
So a major problem during this time was the poverty level in America. So this chart shows you what the poverty level looked like. So in 1983, shortly after Reagan came into office, the poverty rate was at 15.2%. Okay, and it does lower a little bit, but then it comes right back up to about the same place in 1993. Okay, so these are pictures that show what life was like in inner cities. So you had people that were homeless who had to sleep on the streets. You had children that sometimes were abandoned by their parents. They didn't really have anyone to look after them. So these are the effects of so many Americans living in poverty. So the economic recession in 1981 and 1982. So this was right after Ronald Reagan came into office. So economist Arthur Laffer predicted that lower tax rates would generate so much economic activity that federal tax revenues would actually increase. So Congress approved a $675 billion tax cut in July 1981 with significant Democratic support. So that's kind of important if you consider that Reagan was a Republican, that he was also able to get support from the Democratic Party for this. So Reagan's tax bill and the defeat of PATCO, which was the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, not only enhanced the economic power of corporations and high-income households, they confirmed that a new conservative age had dawned in American life. So Congress approved Reagan's request for $1.2 trillion in new military spending. So we see that just kind of federal monies are being shifted and being put now towards the military. So the combination of lower taxes and higher defense budgets caused the national debt to balloon. So unemployment rose to nearly 11%, which was the highest figure since the Great Depression. Reductions in social welfare spending heightened the impact of the recession on ordinary people. So at this time, all these social welfare programs like food stamps or like Medicaid, Medicare, it was really felt by ordinary people who needed this assistance to survive. So Congress had followed Reagan's lead by reducing funding for things like food stamps and aid to families with dependent children, and removed 500,000 people from the supplemental Social Security program for the physically disabled. The head of the NAACP, which the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it's a civil rights organization in the United States, which was formed in 1909, and the main goal of it is to advance justice for African Americans. So the head of the NAACP declared that the administration budget cuts had rekindled war, pestilence, famine, and death. Confronted with recession and harsh public criticism, a chastened White House worked with Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill in 1982 on a bill that restored $98 billion of the previous year's tax cuts. Okay, so we see that they tried to reduce or cut taxes, and then they realized that that caused a recession, and so they were trying to restore some of the money that they had taken away from the previous year. Okay, so during this time, we have what's called Reaganomics, which is basically how Reagan dealt with economics. It's just combining Reagan with the word economics. So look at how Reaganomics worked.
Reaganomics refers to the economic policies of Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States of America. We're going to take a look at the economic policy that still affects your paycheck to this day. When Ronald Reagan was elected to be the 40th President of the United States in 1980, the nation's economy had been in a state of great inflation since 1965. The decade leading up to Reagan's presidency was characterized by something called stagflation, where prices were rising even as unemployment remained high and economic growth was slow or stalled. This not only damaged the U.S. economy, but economies around the world. Reagan's solution was an economic plan that became to be known by his supporters and critics alike as Reaganomics. Reaganomics was heavily based on the trickle-down theory. This argues that if you lower costs for corporations by cutting their taxes, businesses use those savings to invest. The thinking was more money for corporations would mean more jobs and higher wages for workers and thus increased spending. But trickle-down is a controversial idea. Opponents argue that when corporate taxes are cut, domestic social programs suffer. And most likely only a small handful of rich individuals at the top become even richer. Reaganomics wasn't just about tax cuts. The policy had three other central points: deregulating businesses, turning government services over to private contractors, and decreasing spending on domestic social programs, including food stamps, Social Security, and disability insurance. During his presidency, Reagan signed two tax bills into law, one in 1981 and the other in 1986. As a combined result of the 1981 and 1986 bills, the top income tax rate was slashed from 70 to 28%, the lowest income tax rates for the rich since the 1920s. Reagan's policies were highly debated, and economists still argue about the pros and cons of Reaganomics in terms of both immediate and lasting effects. Proponents argue that by 1983, the nation's economy had started to recover from stagflation. This led to a period of economic prosperity that continued through the rest of Reagan's presidency, though another recession soon followed after he left office. But critics argue that based on a normal economic cycle, the economy would have recovered from the recession on its own without Reaganomics. Critics also point out that Reaganomics led to larger, not smaller, budget deficits and a larger national debt. Many people say Reagan giving corporate tax cuts while cutting funding for domestic social programs was a policy that favored the rich and led to increased wealth inequality. While Republicans tend to reference Reaganomics as exemplary policies, Democrats almost always bring it up as an example of corporate greed that hurts the middle and working classes. Either way, it remains a defining part of Ronald Reagan's presidency and legacy.
So the whole point of Reaganomics was to reduce government spending on domestic programs, reduce taxes for individuals, businesses, and investments, and to reduce the burden of regulations on businesses. So Reagan wasn't doing too hot based off of the beginning of his presidency where America was in a recession. But Reagan was able to kind of bounce back and get the public on his side again. So Reagan appointed a bipartisan panel to consider changes to the Social Security program. So basically this panel was made up of Democrats and Republicans. That's what bipartisan means. So the commission recommended a one-time delay in cost of living increases, a new requirement that government employees pay into the system, and a gradual increase in the retirement age from 65 to 67. So Congress quickly passed the recommendations into law, allowing Reagan to take credit for strengthening a program which a lot of Americans really liked. Okay, so we saw that Reagan had a huge lead going into or from the 1980 election, but Reagan was able to kind of increase the amount of which he was able to win in the 1984 election. So in the 1984 election, his opponent was Walter Mondale, and he was only able to win 13 electoral votes. So he won Minnesota and Washington, D.C. So the issues of the day were recession, which makes sense because they had just went through the 1981, 1982 recession, and defense spending. Okay, so what did African American life look like in Reagan's America? So Black Americans achieved significant advances in politics, culture, and socioeconomic status. And this is kind of coming from everything that happened in the 1960s and 1970s with the civil rights movement. So a trend from the late 1960s and 1970s continued, and Black politicians gained control of major municipal governments across the country during the 1980s. Middle-class African Americans found new doors open to them in the 1980s, but however, the poor and working class continued to face challenges. During Reagan's last year in office, the African American poverty rate stood at 31.6% as opposed to 10.1% for white Americans. Okay, so like I just said, we see African Americans kind of becoming more involved in politics. So we have Wilson Goode. He was a mayor of Philadelphia and the first African American to hold that office. He served from 1984 to 1992, a period which included the controversial Move police action and house bombing in 1985. On the right is Harold Washington. He was an American lawyer and politician who was the 51st mayor of Chicago. Washington became the first African American to be elected as the city's mayor in April 1983 after a multiracial coalition of progressives supported his election. Okay, so here we have two firsts of African Americans becoming mayors in their respective cities. Okay, so then we have Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was an American political activist, or is an American political activist, Baptist minister, and politician. He was a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1984 and 1988 and served as a shadow U.S. Senator from the District of Columbia from 1991 to 1997. So he was the first African American man to run for president. Okay, so now we're going to look at African Americans in pop culture. So a pretty popular actor even today is Eddie Murphy. So Eddie Murphy is an American actor, comedian, and producer. He rose to fame on the sketch comedy show Saturday Night Live, and he was a regular on that show from 1980 to 1984. We also see Eddie Murphy in two pretty popular films, Another 48 Hours and Beverly Hills. So often in films like this, Eddie Murphy was had roles as a cop or someone that worked for law enforcement. Okay, so then we have Michael Jackson. So Michael Jackson was an American singer, songwriter, and dancer. He was often considered the king of pop, and he is regarded as one of the most significant cultural figures of the 20th century. So Michael Jackson had a premature death, and he died from cardiac arrest after drugs that were prescribed for sleep from his physician. Okay, so Whitney Houston and Tina Turner were also really important singers during the 1980s. Whitney Houston is an American singer and actress. She is one of the best-selling recording artists of all time, and she has a sales record of over 200 million records worldwide. So her singing style was largely inspired by gospel music, and she had an innovative influence on popular music. And then Tina Turner is an American-born Swiss singer and actress. She is widely referred to as the Queen of Rock and Roll, and she rose to prominence as the lead singer of the Ike and Tina Turner show. And then she was able to launch a successful career as a solo performer. So someone who we looked at before when we were looking at the civil rights movement in the 1950s with Little Rock Nine, how she interviewed 7 of the members of the Little Rock Nine. We have Oprah Winfrey. So Oprah Winfrey is still pretty popular to this day. So she is an American talk show host, television producer, actress, author, and philanthropist. So she really does a lot to try to, help other people out, and kind of show what issues are going on in America through her talk show. Okay, so on the other side of looking at African American life, we have Bernard, known as the Subway Vigilante. So he was an American vigilante who rose to national fame when he shot 4 African American males who are pictured on the right on a New York City subway train on December 22nd, 1984. So even though we have these really influential and popular African Americans kind of coming to light, we still have violence towards African Americans. Okay, so we're going to look at culture in the 1980s. So pretty popular movies during the 1980s kind of focused on the Cold War. But we have Rambo and Top Gun. So Rambo was in this movie, he's a Vietnam veteran. Main actor who plays Rambo is Sylvester Stallone. He wanders into a small town in search of an old friend, but is met with intolerance and brutality by the local sheriff. So when deputies restrain and shave Rambo, he flashes back to his time as a prisoner of war and unleashes his fury on the officers. And then Top Gun was a pretty popular movie with Tom Cruise, and this is about the Top Gun naval fighter weapons school is where the best trained to refine their flying skills. So when Tom Cruise is sent to the school, his attitude puts him at odds with the other pilots. So it's just showing about what life was like for American pilots. Okay, so both military-based movies. Okay, so then we have Platoon and Born on the 4th of July. So these were produced by Oliver Stone, who is an American film director, producer, and screenwriter. So these kind of show a little bit more so like the dark side of the Vietnam War. And just fighting overall. So in Platoon, the main actor, which is Charlie Sheen, he leaves his university studies to enlist in the Vietnam War in 1967. So once he's actually there, his idealistic vision about fighting in Vietnam kind of fades. And it's just going over what his experience is like leaving America, being drafted, going and fighting in the Vietnam War. And then Born on the 4th of July. So we see another Tom Cruise movie where in the mid-1960s, Tom Cruise enlisted in the Marines because he felt like that was his patriotic duty. During his second tour in Vietnam, he accidentally kills a fellow soldier and later becomes permanently paralyzed in battle. So once again, these are movies where people have like idealized visions about what they believe Vietnam will be like, and they feel like it's going to bring them glory and it's their duty. But once they get there, they realize how terrible it actually is. Okay, so then another kind of looking at the singer side of entertainment, we have Madonna.
Life is a mystery. Everyone
So Madonna, who is still fairly popular today, but she is considered one of the most influential figures in pop culture, and she's often been referred to as the Queen of Pop. Okay, so we have Sandra Day O'Connor. So Sandra Day O'Connor is really important. She's an American retired attorney and politician, and she served as the first female Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States from 1981 to 2006. She was the first woman nominated and subsequently the first woman confirmed. So very important, first woman to serve as a Supreme Court justice. And then we have Geraldine Ferraro. So she was the first woman to run on a major party's presidential ticket. Ferraro was an American politician, diplomat, and attorney, and she served in the United States House of Representatives from 1979 to 1985, and she was the Democratic Party's vice presidential nominee in 1984, and she ran alongside former Vice President Walter Mondale. This made her the first female vice presidential nominee representing a major American political party. So this was very big news, and it's a little bit crazy to think that it wasn't until the 1980s that we had a female running on one of the two major party tickets. Okay, but as we saw with that election, Ronald Reagan had ended up with a huge win over Mondale. So a pretty controversial issue, which remains controversial today, is the abortion issue. So Senators Jesse Helms of North Carolina and Orrin Hatch of Utah introduced versions of a human life amendment to the U.S. Constitution that define life as beginning at conception. So the 1976 Hyde Amendment prohibited the use of federal funds to pay for abortions, and by 1990, almost every state had its own version of the Hyde Amendment. So as we have more conservatives who are in power, we see them focusing more on the abortion issue and trying to remove federal funds to pay for abortions because they don't agree with abortions. So in 1988, evangelical activist Randall Terry founded Operation Rescue. So Operation Rescue was an organization that targeted abortion clinics and pro-choice politicians with confrontational and sometimes violent tactics. So what Operation Rescue would look like is they might kind of bombard or go into an abortion clinic, and they might try to show the people who are there like wanting to get an abortion, like a movie that shows someone having an abortion to try to dissuade them from going through with it. And sometimes they might bomb a clinic. So they used confrontational and sometimes violent tactics. Okay. So alongside with the drug advertisements, we also have advertisements for or showing the spread of AIDS, because during this time that was a major concern. So it's just trying to make sure that people understand how AIDS can spread, because people are very, very worried about contracting AIDS. So we have ads like the first one saying, some people think you can catch AIDS from a glass. You can't. And it provides a number to call and ask about how AIDS spreads. So same thing with the second poster. Don't listen to rumors about AIDS, get the facts. So there was a lot of misinformation going on during this time about how AIDS spread. So people created posters and advertisements to just say that they needed to call like a hotline to understand how it spread, how it was contracted, things like that. Okay, they also had an AIDS memorial quilt, which essentially the whole goal of it was to inform the country and to make sure that misinformation was not being spread. And it also celebrated the lives of people who had died of AIDS-related causes. So the quilt weighed an estimated 54 tons, and it is the largest piece of community folk art in the world as of 2020. Okay, so now we're going to look at what the new right looked like abroad. So we have the Reagan Doctrine. So with the Reagan Doctrine, Reagan believed it was the duty of the United States to speed the Soviet Union to its inevitable demise. So we're still in the Cold War, which we've been in for about 40 years at this point, since the end of the 1940s. The Reagan Doctrine declared that the United States would supply aid to anti-communist forces everywhere in the world. So this is just kind of a building off of other doctrine that we've had in the past, of just like the Truman Doctrine, saying that we would help anti-communist forces and to prevent communism from spreading. So federal spending on defense rose from $171 billion in 1981 to $229 billion in 1985, which was the highest level since the Vietnam War. So we see a huge increase in spending on the military. Okay, then we have Operation Urgent Fury, which was the U.S. invasion of Grenada. So Operation Urgent Fury, this was the United States invasion of Grenada, which began on October 25th, 1983. So the U.S. and a coalition, or just a group of 6 Caribbean nations, invaded the island nation of Grenada, which is 100 miles north of Venezuela. So this was codenamed Operation Agent Fury by the U.S. military, and it resulted in military occupation within a few days. So what was the Reagan administration's role in the Middle East? So in 1980, when Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, the United States supplied Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein with military intelligence and business credits, even after it became clear that Iraqi forces were using chemical weapons. Then 2 years later, Reagan's greatest setback in the Middle East came when, shortly after Israel invaded Lebanon, he dispatched Marines to the Lebanese city of Beirut to serve as a peacekeeping force. Then, about a year later, on October 23rd, 1983, and so initially, the problem was not necessarily sending them there in the first place, but on October 23rd, 1983, a suicide bomber killed 241 Marines stationed at Beirut in Lebanon. So a few months later, in March 1984, congressional pressure and anger from the American public forced Reagan to recall the Marines from Lebanon in March 1984. So obviously Americans were pretty upset that Reagan had sent Marines there in the first place, and then it just made matters worse that a suicide bomber came in and killed a lot of American soldiers or Marines. So public support was not great for Reagan, so he decided to recall the Marines from Lebanon in March 1984. Okay, so we have the Iran-Contra affair. So this was often referred to as the Iran-Contra scandal, also the McFarlane affair, but it was a political scandal in the United States that occurred during the second term of the Reagan administration.
It was one of America's most notorious presidential scandals that almost cost Ronald Reagan his presidency. The Iran-Contra affair. In the early 1980s, the U.S. was still in a Cold War with Russia. and anti-communist sentiment was strong. During his presidential campaign, Reagan promised to assist anti-communist insurgencies around the world. For a brief time under Reagan, the CIA trained and assisted groups fighting communist leaders abroad. Reagan was particularly interested in a group called the Contras and their battle in Nicaragua. The Contras were a group battling the Cuban-backed Sandinistas, a communist group who had seized power in 1979. Reagan called the Contras the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. But much of the Contras funding came from the cocaine trade. Because of this, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, specifically aimed at keeping American money from funding the group. That happened in 1982, shortly after Reagan took office. The amendment restricted the CIA and Department of Defense from using funds to provide military assistance to groups that were trying to overthrow Nicaragua's government, groups like the Contras. This didn't stop Reagan. The president told his national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, to help the Contras anyway, regardless of the cost. McFarlane found opportunity in Iran. In 1985, an Iranian-backed terrorist group held 7 American hostages in Lebanon. Reagan insisted his advisors find a way to bring the hostages home, saying, "I want you to do whatever you have to do to help these people keep body and soul together." So with permission from Reagan, McFarlane made a deal. The U.S. would give Iran weapons, and Iran would broker the release of the hostages. This happened even though Reagan publicly insisted he would not negotiate with terrorists, and despite the fact that there was a trade embargo with Iran. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The deal with Iran didn't just secretly secure the release of the hostages in exchange for weapons. There was money involved. While $30 million had been allocated for the weapons, the CIA funneled a portion of that money to the Contras in Nicaragua, the group Reagan supported in their guerrilla fight against the Sandinista government. In 1986, the Lebanese newspaper Al-Shura reported the arms deal, and everything began to unravel. That prompted an investigation by the U.S. Attorney General, who discovered that only $12 million of the $30 million actually went toward weapons for Iran. The rest of the money was sent to the Contras in Nicaragua. The revelations were explosive. Reagan denied the allegations that he had negotiated with terrorists, but Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North came forward and acknowledged that he diverted funds to the Contras. North also said Reagan knew about it. North's testimony would inspire the press and Congress to launch investigations against Reagan for the rest of his presidency. Texas Senator John Tower led the investigation into the scandal. The Tower Commission determined it was Reagan's lack of oversight that allowed Iran-Contra to happen, but did not implicate Reagan directly. It wasn't until another congressional investigation in 1987 that Reagan finally testified. On May 5th, 1987, joint hearings were televised investigating the covert arms deal with Iran and the assistance to Nicaragua. The hearings would go on for 41 days. Reagan was never charged, but McFarlane, Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter, were all found guilty. Yet, speculation about Reagan's involvement lingered on. Press investigations would go on for years to follow. While Reagan's image suffered a bit, he still left office with one of the highest approval ratings of any president in U.S. history.
Okay, so then we get to the election of 1988. So Reagan has already served his 2 terms. So the Republicans nominate Bush and the Democrats nominate Dukakis. So in the 1988 election, Dukakis won West Virginia, and here we see this happening again. where the vote gets split. Dukakis won West Virginia. However, one elector cast a vote for the Democratic vice president candidate, Lloyd Benson. So the issues of the day were the stock market crash, Iran-Contra, progress in U.S. and USSR relations. So as we see, Americans seemed fairly happy with the way that the Republican Party was running the country, and there was a pretty big victory for the Republican Party. Okay, so here we have President George H.W. Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush. So George Bush was the 41st president, and he served only one term from 1889 to 1993. He brought to the White House a dedication to traditional American values and a determination to direct them toward making the United States a kinder and gentler nation in the face of a dramatically changing world. So his greatest test came when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, then threatened to move into Saudi Arabia. Vowing to free Kuwait, Bush rallied the United Nations, the U.S. people, and Congress and sent 425,000 American troops. They were joined by 180,000 troops from allied nations, and after weeks of air and missile bombardment, the 100-hour land battle, dubbed Desert Storm, routed Iraq's million-man army. Then we have his wife, First Lady Barbara Bush. So Barbara Bush was really focused on the importance of family literacy, and this was one of her major focuses as First Lady. She called it the most important issue we have. She became involved with many literacy organizations, she served on literacy committees, and chaired many reading organizations. And eventually, she helped develop the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. Okay, so that was a pretty important project that she took on when she was First Lady. Because we start to see the First Lady take on more important roles during their husband's term as president. Okay, so we have the Gulf War, which we'll watch a video about what the Gulf War was.
Over the past century, the United States has gotten involved in its fair share of Middle Eastern affairs. In 1991, America again found itself in the middle of an armed clash, this time between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and its neighbor Kuwait, in what would become known as the Persian Gulf War. Here are 5 points you should know to better understand this conflict. Few people would have called Saddam Hussein a stable leader. From the start of his reign in 1979, he ruled with an iron and often reckless fist. In 1990, Saddam sought to acquire Kuwait's vast oil reserves. Publicly, he justified the invasion by claiming that Kuwait belonged to Iraq in the first place and had been unfairly carved out as a separate country by the League of Nations. However, Kuwait actually became independent before Iraq's sovereignty, making his thinly veiled argument ridiculous. Either way, Saddam seized Kuwait on August 8, 1990, causing an international uproar, with the United States being the loudest voice.
The United States strongly condemns the Iraqi military invasion of Kuwait.
Soon after the invasion, the United Nations Security Council declared that if Saddam's forces did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991, military force would be used. You can guess what happened. On January 16th, the offensive against the Iraqi army began, fought by a broad coalition of armed forces from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, among many others. The first stage of the Gulf War was named Operation Desert Shield, which actually began before the international coalition was brought together. When Saddam first invaded Kuwait, the United States rushed troops into Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, to prevent a possible attack. But after the Security Council's declaration of war, it became the American force that would invade Kuwait. The main phase of the war was codenamed Operation Desert Storm, which began on the morning of January 17, 1991. Desert Storm was a massive bombing campaign targeting Iraqi aircraft, anti-air defenses, oil refineries, communication lines, weapon factories, bridges, and roads using the latest American military technology, including stealth bombers, cruise missiles, and smart bombs. After a month of Desert Storm, the coalition aimed to finish the job. The coalition's ground offensive, known as Operation Desert Saber, began on February 24th, 1991. By February 28th, the war was over.
And as president, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
In 4 days, the U.S.-led forces retook Kuwait's capital and forced the entire Iraqi army into retreat. In all, Iraq lost somewhere around 30,000 soldiers, while America and its allies only lost 292 total. The Persian Gulf War was an easy and lopsided victory for the United States, but not one without serious consequences. President George H.W. Bush decided not to depose Saddam Hussein, as he didn't believe regime change would be popular with America's allies. In the wake of the war, Kurdish and Shiite Iraqis rose up against Saddam, who in turn brutally crushed their rebellions. After the UN accused him of using chemical weapons against his own civilians, Saddam was forced to allow UN inspectors into Iraq. He barred the inspectors in 1997, and from then on, it became the United States' goal to remove Saddam from power. This snowballed into the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Saddam Hussein's capture by American forces in 2003. He was tried, convicted, and executed by the new Iraqi government in 2006.
Young people in large numbers came out.
Okay. So the conclusion to these two presidencies, so Reagan left office in 1988 with the Cold War waning and the economy booming, but the economic gains of the decade were unequally distributed. So technically he left office on a high, but with more than 80% of the federal budget committed to defense, entitlement programs, and interest on the national debt, the right's goal of deficit elimination floundered for lack of substantial areas to cut. So the discourse of American politics had irrevocably changed, and the preeminence of conservative political ideas grew ever more pronounced, even when Democrats controlled Congress or the White House. So we see that American politics completely changed based on these conservative ideals, which were affecting even the Democrats who controlled Congress or were in the White House. So in response to the conservative mood of the country, the Democratic Party adapted its own message to accommodate many of the Republicans' Reagan-era ideas and innovations, and it was clear that the United States was on a rightward path. So next, with our lecture next week, it'll be the last lecture. We'll look at the recent past, and we'll look at Bill Clinton's presidency. He was president right after George Bush up until present day.